Hello, everyone. My name is Robert Winfree, and what you're about to listen to is an old episode of a podcast I used to host called Everyone Loves a Bad Guy. This particular episode originally aired November 22nd, 2013. I feel so old, as we set to re-air it in 2023. This features a discussion between myself, Mark Radulich, and Pat Mullin, where they school me a little bit on the geography of New York City at the beginning, as I unfortunately misidentify Pat Mullin's place of residence at the time. So that's fun. We're talking about promoters, which is an interesting one. I tried, for the most part, to keep Everyone Loves a Bad Guy away from real-world people. I don't know. The reason why should be somewhat obvious. It either was not going to say anything useful or was going to tread into territory that I did not wish to go into when it comes to that, for the most part. This is an exception because I wanted to tackle the entire, essentially, profession of promoting, usually as it pertains to fight sports. We don't get too much into the music side of things, although we absolutely could have. This episode was a little over 2 hours long when I first recorded it. I've edited it down a bit. It's just a little less than that now. But we could have easily gone into people in Hollywood. That would be more managers than promoters, but really is there much of a difference? Or the music industry. The three of us had a lot more expertise talking about the combat sports side of things, or the professional wrestling side of things. So we talk a lot about that. There is some discussion of fictional characters, because there have been some really good fictional characters in this space as well. And we talk about real people, real-world incidents, that stuff as well. So it's a fun discussion. It's one of the more interesting ones I think we had throughout the course of the show. So thank you very much, as always, for listening. Any interaction you can do with the product is very appreciated. And with all of that out of the way, thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the show.
When the devil is too busy and death a bit too much, they call on me by name, you see, for my special touch. To the gentlemen, I'm misfortune. To the ladies, I'm surprise. But call me by any name, anyway, it's all the same. I'm the fly in your suit, I'm the pebble in your shoe, I'm the bee beneath your bed, I'm the bump on every head, I'm the heel on which you slip, I'm a pin in every head, I'm the thorn in your side, makes you wriggle and writhe, and it's so easy when you're evil. This is the life you see, the devil tips his hat to me, I do it all because I'm evil, and I do it all for free. Your tears are all the pay I'll ever need.
Yes, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. If I sound a little out of breath, that's because my personal life kind of sucks at times, and I had to run to get here to make the show and start it close to on time. We are a little bit late, and for that I do apologize. To everyone listening and to my esteemed guests for this evening's podcast. But this is Everyone Loves a Bad Guy, and tonight we're taking on a somewhat topical subject inspired in almost equal parts by real-life events and the movie Catching Fire, the second Hunger Games film, which came out today. We're talking about promoters and the long list of scumbag promoters, be they real or fictional, and it's actually a case where truth is stranger than fiction because you don't have that many great fictional promoters, and if you do, they tend to borrow heavily from real promoters because it's just such a scumbag-laden industry, it seems. But you're not going to listen to me talk to myself. I mentioned we have two guests this evening. Normally, there's only one at a time. This is a first. We're having more than one, but I can't talk about promoters without talking about boxing, and I certainly can't talk about boxing without bringing on the boxing aficionado, the man who lives in New Jersey, who's from Long Island, who for some reason enjoys the television show Seinfeld. Hey, your mileage varies. Pat Mullin is here with us. How you doing today, Pat?
I am fantastic, Bill. A little bit offended that you identified me as being from Long Island. That would be our co-host. I am, however, from Brooklyn.
Oh, Brooklyn, It's a giant city. Boroughs, it's a giant city. It's all the same city from where I sit. Yes, I've driven through New York once, so everyone listening in New York who I have now offended by lumping you all together, I do apologize. You are from Brooklyn, that is correct.
Robert, I suggest you never drive through Brooklyn after confusing it with Long Island now that people know who you are.
Yes, and I'm sure all the Manhattan people are perfectly happy to be, associated with those from the Bronx as well. I don't know. I mentioned, yes, we have another one. There's two guests today because we're also going to talk some pro wrestling promoters and some MMA promoters and that whole 9 yards. And consequently, since I know he's been around both of those industries for a while, and that's not just a veiled age gag, Mark Radulich is here, the esteemed host of the 411 Ground and Pound radio show and co-founder of The Long Road to Ruin. Mark, thank you very much for being here as well, and I do apologize for being late.
All right, clearly you were raised on Common Core, like many of the children these days, and you don't know your geography. Brooklyn, Queens, and Long Island are all on the actual same physical island, but they are not one and the same. Nassau County and Suffolk County, which constitute Long Island, are one demographic place, and Brooklyn and Queens, while they are two of the 5 boroughs, they are actually part of New York City. We are not one and the same. Get it right.
Okay. Now that I've offended everyone in that particular portion of the East Coast, hey, I suppose if I wanted, how about I get this out of the way and say there's no difference between Orange County and Los Angeles either, since I can offend the West Coast at the same time.
Yeah, but we know there is no difference.
But wait a minute. Now, why do you insist on offending anybody? Why can't you just be nice?
Well, I can't leave one coast offended and the other unoffended. Now they're on equal terms again, and we can all move forward.
Let's move forward before this gets silly.
Yes.
Too late.
We can't have silliness on an internet podcast. The fabric of the universe might just tear apart.
There's no such thing as silly on a Radulich and Broadcasting podcast, as we all know.
I listened to the last Metal Hammer of Doom, sir. You don't get to play that card.
All right.
All right. But we're talking about promoters, and this was partially inspired by yet another Dana White public temper tantrum that occurred after UFC 167. But, I mentioned at the top of the show, promoting seems to be a scumbag-laden business. And this goes from the guy promoting semi-pro hockey all the way up to like Vince McMahon and Dana White, or Bob Arum if you want to get technical about money. There's just tons and tons and tons of scumbags. An honest, legitimate, nice guy can't seem to get a foothold in the world of promoting anything really. So just, Pat, I want to start with you. What's up with that? What is it about this profession that makes it so difficult to find a guy who is not the scum of the earth?
Well, I think part of it just has to do with the job itself, because ultimately, as a promoter in a combat sport or professional wrestling or even the circus, a la P.T. Barnum, you're taking the work of other people and using it to position yourself to make money off of it without having to put in the physically demanding work that's being done, underneath your auspices. And especially when you get into people who promote boxing or mixed martial arts in that extent, you become somebody who lives literally off of the blood of others. And in order to do that, you have to lack some conscience. And if you lack some conscience and you're in that business, it's not too slippery a slope for you to all of a sudden just go down and go from a guy who maybe had a little bit of humanity left in him to a guy who ultimately loves seeing 2 battered, bloody, beaten and disheveled men while an audience cheers rabidly because all you see at that point are $2 signs in the ring duking it out with each other, and you don't have to pay any of the price they have, and you've made more money than both of them have. So it's ultimately a job for somebody with little to no conscience, little to no qualms about other people getting hurt or getting in their way and getting hurt. And I think that's what's inherently drawn certain personality types into this job of being a promoter.
Can I weigh in here in defense of promoters?
Let me also say, not every promoter under God's green earth falls into the scumbag category. I know there are There are and look, for as much as Vince McMahon gets demonized, there were plenty worse promoters of professional wrestling back in the territory days than Vince Jr., as he was called at the time. I mean, not all of them are people who we wish immolation on, but as a general rule. So, yeah, by all means, Mark, I hate to cut you off there. I'm just
No, it's fine. I do it. Lord knows I've done it to enough people myself. Look, I'm not in total disagreement with Pat. I think to a large extent, there are people who are, shall we say, without humanity. I think that's kind of where Pat was coming from, if I can speak for him for just a moment. The idea of what ends up happening is I think you have people who, and this is where I'm going to start my defense. You have to understand that promoters are also businessmen. They are small business owners, if you will. And what happens is they take in a tremendous amount of financial risk many times to put together a show. I don't think people really know what goes into a show when you consider there are a lot of costs, venues, talent, insurance, etc. So there's a lot of financial risk that goes into just getting the thing going. Then you got to make sure people come. So there has to be a certain amount of single-mindedness, I think, that kind of goes along with that. I think, unfortunately, because of that single-mindedness, sometimes the business owner tends to forget that these are people, not bears, not robots, that they're trying to get to perform for money, and that's where a lot of the scumbag stuff tends to come from. But ultimately, they're just like you and me. The promoters are just people trying to make a living, and they're taking a tremendous amount of financial risk and putting together a show for the entertainment of others. In an ideal world, they remember their humanity and that the people working for them are not just talent but people. But they're not perfect, and that tends to be forgotten at times. And as you said, not every promoter is an absolute scumbag. But if you're the talent and you feel like you're worth more than what the promoter is paying you, and the promoter does the math and says, no, you're only worth this much, then there is no winning for the promoter. You're going to be looked at as a scumbag no matter what, because you didn't give the talent what they thought they were worth, and they might not actually be worth it. You see what I'm saying? So let's just qualify this whole discussion with there are definitely some promoters who they cannot be saved. These are awful people, but they would have been awful no matter what they did, not just because they're promoters.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. It almost becomes kind of a, do you have, a lack of humanity because you're a promoter, or are you a promoter because you have a lack of humanity? Which comes first necessarily? And there are promoters out there who are not bad people, and we acknowledge them, but since we're here to talk about bad guys and people we love to hate, we're going to kind of set them off to the side and say, thank you for being good people. You get no publicity, and now I'm contributing to the horrible culture that we live in right now.
Isn't that just the way, though? It's always the bad children that get the attention, and the good children wonder why they're good in the first place, because they don't get any attention.
I'm sorry personally to J. Russell Peltz, who I can honestly say is a good promoter and a good guy.
Can I,
okay.
before we continue, just 1 second, I want to add one last thing, and then I swear to God I'll shut up and give you your show back. Well, I say that a lot to you on this, don't I?
It has come up in the past. It's all right.
Really quickly, as we all know, I'm an amateur judge, and and in being an amateur judge, I've talked to a lot of amateur MMA promoters, and there's not what comes up time and time again is there's not a tremendous amount of money in promoting an amateur MMA event. So what you get are gym owners that are trying to promote their gym. And as such, they put on fights where their fighters will fight other gyms' fighters, and if their fighters win, that looks good for their gym. And then that's where the real money is made, so people come and sign up for training. In other cases, it's people who they want to get into MMA. This is a foothold, and you don't have to pay the fighters because in amateur MMA, it's about experience. It's not about making the kind of money you would make in professional fighting. So there are absolutely people who are going ahead and taking risks for the, just to be part of the industry in some way. And I wanted to kind of speak for them. There's a bunch of promoters out here in Tampa that I actually think do good work, and I don't think they screw people at all.
Yeah. Thank you for pointing that out, Mark. And yes, again, there are good people out there who do promotional work for whether they start their own, fight promotion or whatever you happen to be doing. There are good people out there, folks, and we encourage you to acknowledge them and recognize their talent, recognize what they do and how they do it, and thank them for their effort. And if you ever want to know, well, how do I know if so-and-so is a good person or not? That's why I have this show. So I can point to someone and go, there, bad person. Don't be like that. Now, I want to kind of start with boxing for a little bit, since it's older than time itself, apparently. So I want to go with you, Pat. For my money, and maybe I'm misinformed about elements of this, but one of the first names that I think of, and maybe not a lot of people are going to think of this when I talk about boxing promoters who I happen to not necessarily hold in very high esteem, is way back in the day. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, but a guy by the name of Tex Rickard, who promoted the first. Well, I always remember him because he promoted the title fight between Jim Jeffries and Jack Johnson back in the mid-'20s, and just the slew of racially tense statements that he was able to kind of use to promote that fight. And it's kind of all downhill since then. But from your perspective, being being the boxing fan that you are and the training that you've done, if you were to kind of single out a promoter who you really just kind of makes your teeth set on edge in the world of boxing, where would you start?
I think Tex Rickard is absolutely the right guy to start with, and as you heard me pronounce it, you pronounced it perfectly. Rickard was really boxing's first notorious promoter during his career as a promoter in boxing actually started in the 1910s. And actually just a little bit before that, I guess you'd have to call it the 1900s because there's no single-digit decade development, but he promoted a lot of boxing matches after he had done some gold mining in Nome, Alaska, when he became friends with Wyatt Earp, of all people, just that Wyatt Earp, who had actually served as a boxing referee in several fights. And he promoted a lot of early notorious fights, particularly one between future heavyweight champion, first ever 3-division champion, Bob Fitzsimmons, and Sailor Tom Sharkey in San Francisco. And actually, when Johnson won the title, Rickard had actually thought that there would be a downturn economically in boxing, so he withdrew from promoting for a time up until Johnson lost the title in 1915 to Jess Willard. Now, he really became notorious in the 20s when he secured the right to promote live events from Madison Square Garden, and actually was responsible for the building of the third Madison Square Garden that was finished in 1925, and branched out to build the first Boston Garden. His coup was becoming the official promoter of heavyweight champion Jack Dempsey, who was one of the first 5 sports heroes of the era, amongst them Red Grange, Bobby Jones, Bill Tilden, and Babe Ruth. And, Jack Dempsey was actually the biggest star of them. So when Rickard scored him as the promoter, he scored numerous deals just for being the only guy who could get Dempsey. Now, perhaps his most, we'll call it notorious promotional thing, happened in a town called Shelby, Montana. Shelby, Montana was a burgeoning town where oil had been discovered. It was the only town in the near area that had oil at the time, so they thought they were going to become a major tourist attraction. They built a railway that could get you from Montana to California, knowing that the San Francisco Gold Rush attracted people to go out west. Several banks came up once the oil was discovered, and the town became a burgeoning, highlight for tourists. They thought the next step necessary to become a major city was to stage a heavyweight title fight. So they got in touch with Tex Rickard, who, suggested, that they bring Dempsey in, but he made certain assurances. He had the town guarantee their travel. He had a guaranteed purse laid out for the champion. He had a guaranteed purse laid out for the challenger, and he really just bent the town financially to its knees for them to secure anything that was going to happen there for this fight. They built an arena that would hold, I believe, roughly over 20,000 people. And the challenger they picked was a guy named Tommy Gibbons, who was a good fighter, an intelligent guy, but somebody just not quite on Dempsey's level. And because of his lack of drawing power, basically the arena, which was the size of a football field, they got less than 8,000 paid spectators there. 100, for a town that thought it was going to be the next big city, they had to give away over 13,000 tickets. Shelby itself saw all of its economic boom collapse. All of the banks that had opened up in the town were closed something like a week after the fight. And Rickard didn't bat an eyelash and basically acknowledged that he crippled an entire town and an entire small economy just to stage a fight so he could walk out with a few bucks.
Yeah, and that kind of in a nutshell is, when we talk about promoters that we don't like and that fall into the, bad people category, that's the kind of person we're talking about here, ladies and gentlemen. And like I said, my personal distaste for him came about when he got Jim Jeffries out of retirement to fight Jack Johnson, and they turned the whole thing into a race war, essentially, and contested in a boxing ring. And, to his credit as a promoter, that was a huge event, but when you almost spark riots around the country because everyone's so invested in this fight, it's not. I have to question how you went about doing it.
And he couldn't blame it on the Nerzi.
No, he couldn't. All right, Mark, I want to come over to you for a second. This is the first time on this show that we've discussed real people as far as being bad guys and people that we, again, point the finger at and say, no, you're a bad person. Up until this point, we've just done fictional characters and, I suppose, species when I had Sam Arcadi on and we talked about various animals that get a bad rap. But I want to go to you for the let's move into the realm of fiction for just a little bit here. I also bring it up because I believe you've seen a lot more movies than I have, and you're a lot more well versed as far as that goes. As far as fictional promoters go, with bad guys and people who just make you wish harm on them, which is their job as far as being a bad guy in a movie or whatnot. Where do you go? Where does your mind go if I say pick one?
Immediately, I go to Rocky V. I don't remember the character's name.
George Washington Duke.
There we go. Yes, George
Angel
Washington
on his
Duke.
shoulder.
George Washington Duke is probably my favorite fictional evil promoter. He hit all the right notes, and he was aping Don King. You really can't go wrong with a guy who takes, Pat can probably speak to this better than I can, probably one of the most charismatic but also corrupt promoters in boxing, and just try to channel that into an interesting character as a villain in a Rocky movie. Of course, we all know how Rocky V goes. Rocky V is the one where he's suffered brain damage after the fight with Ivan Drago, and he signed power of attorney over, and then they lost all their money, so they had to move back into Philadelphia, and he can't fight anymore, and they're broke. So he starts training Tommy Gunn, and Tommy Gunn goes on a tear, but everyone calls him Rocky's puppet. And the whole time, the whole thing just revolves around Duke not giving a hoot about Rocky's condition or anything else, and saying, let's get you back. First he wants him to fight his own guy. Yeah, Union Kane. Is that what it was?
Union Kane.
Yeah, he wants him to fight Union Kane.
And him after getting off of the airplane back from Russia, if I remember correctly.
Yeah. And the thing of it is that he isn't just like a smarmy guy. He's also very dramatic. Rocky Balboa, he's just talking to him, but he has to do it as if he
it's very bombastic.
Giving a speech. Yeah, Rocky Balboa, you must fight Union. It's like you want to look around and go, are you in a movie? And of course he was, but he didn't know that. It wasn't that kind of a movie. So yeah, he's probably my favorite. And then at the end, touch me and I'll sue. And then he punches him in the face, and Rocky says, "Sue for what?" Not that matters, but it was a fun way to end them.
Well, it was a nice way to see the promoter get kind of what's coming to them, because so frequently, like Pat alluded to, these are people who just kind of by definition make their living off of other people's performance, and that's not limited to promoters. That happens, if you're the CEO of a company, you're making your money based on other people's work by and large. And God bless America and capitalism. I'm not trying to insult that necessarily. But in a circumstance like that, especially a fictional one, this is a person who you really want to see get what's coming to them, and there's just almost no way for it to, happen necessarily, because they don't fight, they don't engage in dangerous activities necessarily. They're just there to push buttons and get people to do what they want them to do. And since like you mentioned, he was kind of aping Don King, and since we're talking boxing for the moment, and again, Pat, you're the boxing guy. As far as Don King, let's talk specifically about Don King for a little bit of time here, because I don't have a lot of memories associated with Don King. Again, for those of you who don't know, I was born in 1985, so a lot of the big boxing heyday and hoopla and all the stuff with Ali happened either before I was born or when I was too young to remember. And I know Pat's Pat and I are pretty close in age, but as as a fan of the sport, I assume you've gone back and done research on the history of it and everything. So I'm just curious, what was it about Don King that even again, promoters have always been around in the sport of boxing, and a lot of them have been less than scrupulous. So what was it about Don King that kind of catapulted him into being the guy we now think of when we think of boxing promoters?
The thing with Don King was he came in as a convicted felon, and with Don King, prior to getting into boxing, had been arrested. Don King had been arrested for manslaughter in his hometown of Cleveland, Ohio, for killing a man by stopping him to death in the street because he allegedly had robbed a gambling house that King ran, because King was doing a lot of business with the local mob in Cleveland. So he was convicted of manslaughter instead of outright murder, and spent the better part of 3.5 years at Marion Correctional Institute, where he would later promote a fight, of course.
Only in America.
Only in America. But with Don was such a mastermind as a criminal, and picked the brains of all these guys he worked for, that he was able to get into a sport that had long been, associated with organized crime as its promotional unit, and made some pretty flawless moves, the first of which was to hook himself up with Muhammad Ali. And he got in touch with Ali's people and Ali's manager, Herbert Muhammad, to do a charity benefit for a hospital, where I think the hospital, in terms of cost to provide everything, broke even, while King made himself a hefty payday and got his name in the paper mentioned with Ali. And from there, getting in touch with Ali's people led him to getting in touch with Joe Frazier's people. And King used some of his underworld connections to finance a fight between Joe Frazier and George Foreman in Kingston, Jamaica. He flew to Jamaica with Frazier, and when Frazier was knocked out in the second round by George, he left Jamaica with George. So not only was King brilliant in setting himself up with a financial backer, but he was also smart enough to know who to leech onto and who to leave and go with the hot hand. And this was a common King practice, as he did the same thing to George Foreman in Zaire, Africa, when Ali beat him. But the real crime and criminal of King is that he got away with so many things that people don't even know about in the general public consensus. And one of them is that when Don would sign a guy to a promotional contract, he automatically had them fire their manager and had to instill his son Carl as their manager. Carl's clip that he received as manager of the fighter was 50% of their purse. Now, standards being what they were, a manager can normally receive anywhere from, say, 10% on a guy taking a lower cut to at most 30%. Carl was taking 50 from these fighters without them even knowing it, because Don King also had a habit of showing them this offer, putting a large briefcase of cash on the table in front of them and saying, if you sign right now, you'll get all of this. But if you don't, you're never going to see this much money again. And, the boxing game is comprised of guys who come from nothing, and when they see that money, it gets awful hard to resist, knowing that it might not be there tomorrow. So they take it, not realizing that they're basically signing away any future earnings right there on the spot.
Yeah, and those types of contracts, they plagued boxing for a long time and still do in some cases.
Yeah, and he's the avid con artist, and I don't know if you guys have seen it. If you haven't, it's on Netflix, and I highly recommend it. It's a documentary called Klitschko about Vladimir and Vitaly Klitschko and their careers, but they both won Olympic gold in '96, and Don King initially saw these two big white heavyweights and, of course, wanted to sign them, so he flew them out to where he was living at the time in Florida, sat down with them and met with them and talked to them about promotion, and he said he was going to entertain them by playing the piano. And he sat down at the piano, and Mozart's Requiem starts playing, and Vladimir starts watching him and saying to Vitaly, my God, this man's not just a promoter, he's an artist. And Vitaly goes, and they're speaking in Ukrainian, of course, so no one can understand them. Vitaly goes, yes, he's a con artist. And it was a player piano that King just happened to be pantomiming to them and basically turned them off from ever signing with them.
Little tricks like that, if you can see through them, it turns you off of a person forever. I mean, there are some bells that can't be unrung, as the saying goes. Now, I want to go to you, Mark, for this one, because I know you've been around professional wrestling for a long time in various forms. That's another profession. That's another game that seems to have been full of really kind of underhanded people. And again, I hate to generalize like that, but you hear horror stories about various promoters from, the territory days of professional wrestling, which a lot of people at contemporary kind of look back on with rose-colored glasses. when we bring that up, who kind of stands out to you as a guy who you just look at and you hear about and you go, that was just not a good situation for anyone involved?
Okay, I want to talk about an actual personal experience. I don't know how many people know this. I know I've talked about it in the past. I try not to talk about it because it's not a part of my life I'm particularly proud of. But
I'm thinking this doesn't involve your dog.
Shut up, Pat.
I'd hazard he guesses a dog. If I'm going to throw out a guess, I'd say XPW.
Okay, so if you guys are just going to talk for me, I'll go back to playing Marvel Lego.
Okay, sorry. Go ahead, Mark.
So, as Robert just gave away, when I went out to California, I went out there to become a screenwriter, and this was right after I graduated college. And I was, now this is 1998, 99, somewhere in there. No, this is late 98. And the 99 is when I started dealing with XPW. And just to sort of backtrack a little bit, I was huge into wrestling at the time. The Monday Night Wars were still hot and heavy, and I just ate, slept, and breathed professional wrestling. And more than wanting to be a professional screenwriter, I would have loved to have been a booker and a writer for wrestling. And so when I saw that there was a local promotion right around where I was living in Los Angeles, I sought them out and I started hanging out with those guys. And as it turns out, this was pornographer Robert Zakari's pet project, otherwise known as Rob Black. So Robert Zakari owned a company called Extreme Associates. They made porno videos. Later on,
still
this
do,
was
I
the
think.
guy that was... The company still does. I think he's finally out of federal prison. Yeah, Robert Zakari has the dubious honor, and his wife, have the dubious honor of having gone to federal prison for pornography back during the John Ashcroft Bush administration, when John Ashcroft was Attorney General. Bill Maher actually kind of made fun of this. But in any case, back then, he was a big mark for wrestling. And this is what I mean by a lot of times people kind of get into these things because they're fans themselves. It's not always, the evil all through and through. So he had some associations with ECW, and he knew Paul Heyman, and he knew some of the wrestlers that were run through ECW. And I think at one point they had a working arrangement where Zakari would provide gals for CW, and in turn, he got the Mark's rub. He got to be around something that he loved too, which was professional wrestling. They had a falling out, and he said, well, if Paul Heyman can do this, so can I. And so he essentially founded ECW West Coast, otherwise known as Extreme Pro Wrestling XPW. And he just copied the same thing. He took the sloppy seconds ECW, like Big Dick Dudley, John Kronos, Sabu wrestled a couple of shows for us, Shane Douglas,
Chris Candido too, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, Chris Candido and Sonny, who I've met and been out to dinner with. Shane Douglas, who I have some really funny stories about. So all these people kind of came over, and he threw a lot of money at them, and they gave his show some degree of legitimacy. On the other side of that, now don't ask me about the details because they're a little sketch, but from what I understand, the kid that played, and I knew him, he was a good guy. He started out as a local indie wrestler, and we had him as like a jobber for us for a while. In fact, notoriously, when we had Nicole Bass working for us, and I went to him, and I was working in the back of the show, I had a gimmick myself where I was coming out with one of the guys from Combat Zone Wrestling as a neo-Nazi skinhead gimmick. And when I was done doing my thing, and I'm talking to some of the guys, I said, hey, you know what you should do? When Nicole Bass chokeslam you should look like she spiked you. Make it look really vicious. Make her look an absolute killer. Yeah, I didn't tell Nicole Bass that. So Nicole Bass legit thinks she killed the kid because it looked like she had, spiked him on his head. And, needless to say, the spot looked awesome. People, none too happy with me in the back. But the kid that we had as a jobber for Nicole would go on to become the Messiah. And, again, from what I understand, he
Did you give that one a thumbs up?
I'm getting there. He crossed the boss, and Rob allegedly,
big legal boilerplate here, allegedly,
paid to have the Messiah's thumbs removed. Now, I can't think of, outside of like financial things, I can't think of a more scumbag thing to do than to have someone's thumbs cut off for whatever the reasons were, and there isn't a justifiable reason. So other than cutting off someone's thumbs, Rob Zakari was a scumbag. He was an absolute horrid human, and look, there's making pornography, and then there's what he did, and what he did was absolutely disgusting, humiliating. There's a reason why John Ashcroft targeted Extreme Associates and not some of the more legitimate pornography companies out there, and he really deserved everything that he got, including going to federal prison. And I don't wish harm on anybody, but if he spends the rest of his life having nightmares from that experience, it'll be just desserts.
Yeah, and for anyone who doesn't, again, Mark kind of summed that up. I believe there's an episode, one of those like true crime documentary television.
America's Most Wanted.
It was actually on America's. I wanted to say that, but I wasn't sure if it was America's Most Wanted.
Yeah, I remember watching it. It's America's Most Wanted.
Yeah, there is an America's Most Wanted segment on. Again, the guy's ring name is the Messiah, and he wrestled for XCW. He still shows up on occasion for Combat Zone wrestling, and yeah, he is missing a thumb. That's not ironically, I think he wrestled like the second Tournament of Death not too long after it happened. So props for being crazy and on the indie scene, I suppose.
The one thing I don't think is cool is, the one thing I don't think is cool though is that XPW caught a lot of heat, and a lot of people good, fuck those guys, due to the whole heat wave incident. For those that don't know, ECW held a pay-per-view in Los Angeles. The XPW guys showed up to try to get on camera and cause a ruckus and basically, get a rub off of ECW on pay-per-view, because I think that was where XPW was headed before, sort of the cart went off the rails. And you got to remember, there were, a couple of actual talent, wrestlers and ballets. I think, Christy Miss was there and kind of got into it with some of the people ringside. But at the end of the day, when ECW's locker room emptied, they didn't beat up the wrestlers. They didn't beat up Rob Zakari. They didn't beat up anybody who mattered. They beat the shit out of the ring guys. And these were all guys that I trained with. These were not bad people. Some of them sipped from the cup of Rob Zakari a little too much. They took in a little too much of the propaganda. But you had to have been there at the time. We thought this promotion. I left by this point. I missed this by about a month. I kind of given up on entertainment as a whole and went on to become a social worker and actually do something valuable with my life. God, I eat those words now, but at the time that was my thought. That was over 10 years ago. And if I had been there, if I had still been in Los Angeles, I might have been one of those guys. It was basically us young guys who put the ring up, trained in the school, and were the workhorses of the company. And they didn't deserve to have full-blown, middle-aged wrestlers kick the living shit out of them for something that, and Rob didn't care. And it's always irked me, because I saw a lot of the comments after it happened. And, it's one thing if you beat the crap out of, Supreme. But Supreme wasn't there, fucking guys who could barely make rent work. So it always kind of irked me.
No, yeah, I defer to you as far as what actually happened there, and if so, that would, if we're in your position, that would annoy me too. And quite frankly, hearing that, what actually happened annoys me. It annoys me now a good deal. And I wasn't even really aware of what had happened with the whole Heatwood thing. I was not a big ECW fan at the time. I wasn't even big into wrestling when ECW was kind of in their heyday. But you were on the West Coast for that. Now, Pat, were you in and around obviously you're from Brooklyn, not necessarily Philadelphia, but where were you when the whole, and I'm going to dovetail this into Paul Heyman in a second, but what was your kind of status when ECW was, blowing up and sparking the revolution and whatever other superfluous adjectives Paul Heyman decided to throw around at the time?
I was a fan still at the time. I was still living in Brooklyn and Jersey. I was on the East Coast, and ECW actually had a syndicated show that you could pick up in the tri-state area here on the MSG network, the Madison Square Garden network, ironically enough, which was the house that Bruno built for the WWF.
I believe you had to stand on top of your house with aluminum foil to catch the signal.
No, it was actually, surprisingly enough, it was actually only in the three-state radius, mind you, at that point for that show. But it was syndicated on Saturday nights from 1 a.m. to 2 a.m. So technically Sunday morning, if you really want to be object about it. And they had a time slot there for the better part of 1994 and 1995 and into 1996 until they were thrown off the air by MSG for staging an incident where Tommy Dreamer's then-girlfriend was having an affair with another woman while pregnant, which apparently that was the line MSG chose to cross and say, no, we can't have this, but we can have a Taipei death match here. Good on the executives for them. But, yeah, and then to pick them up at that point in time was very difficult. They still aired in Florida on, I want to say it's Sports Channel USA or the Sunshine Network, one of the two. I think Sports Channel may have been their Philadelphia home. And then they had another syndicated show that they were still producing that, ironically enough, aired on ETWN, which for anyone in the tri-state area, they will recognize that as a Christian broadcasting network. That was apparently so starved for money that when they sold time slots, they somehow sold the time slot to ECW. And I was able to watch ECW on Christian television, believe it or not.
What do you bet Paul Heyman said were the extremely Christian wrestler, and and the executives never bothered watching the product and just took him at face value?
Which is ironic because Paul Heyman is one of the chosen people.
I used to love coming home, after a night of partying and dancing and going clubbing, to sit on my couch and just, I wasn't quite ready to go to bed, but I wasn't really ready to do anything else, and to come home and catch ECW. And unfortunately, I didn't get to watch it during its real heyday when you had during the height of the Raven and Tommy Dreamer feud. But I remember when I watched the first couple of those episodes that Pat was talking about, and it was like, do they ever wrestle? I remember it took an entire episode for Sandman to get to the...
They would usually have one, maybe two matches in that hour time slot. One of them was usually a squash, and the other was usually a competitive match if they had to. But a lot of it was the Pulp Fiction promos and a lot of advertisements for their videos that you could order of shows hyping up certain matches, which in retrospect is smart because ECW was pretty much living on video and T-shirt sales at that point more than anything. But, yeah, there was not a heavy amount of wrestling time on the show, per se.
Yeah, and I brought that up, I said I wanted to dovetail this into Paul Heyman because Paul Heyman, to me, is kind of everything that's good and bad about being a promoter of anything, sports or professional wrestling or whatever have you. Here's a guy who took something that was marginal, that it was very small to begin with, and he managed to build it up into something legitimate, something that had a recognizable impact in the medium that it existed in. And then so there's all that good stuff, and then at the same time you have some of the horror stories that come out about him, about checks being bounced and he telling the locker room essentially that he was securing them television rights or whatnot, when in actuality he's in Los Angeles filming the crappy Rollerball remake. So I just, I want to go to both of you guys on this one, Mark first and then Pat, just about Paul Heyman in general, because I also kind of view him as like the last real kind of professional wrestling promoter to kind of come up. I mean, we still have Vince McMahon, and God bless him going strong and doing what he's doing with the WWE, but after Paul Heyman kind of had his, moment in the sun there haven't really been, certainly not to that level, but he was just kind of the last great, promoter of professional wrestling outside of Vince McMahon. I mean, am I off base here, or so? Just Mark, go ahead and kind of start from.
Paul Heyman had an extremely high cult of personality. He was so charismatic. I mean, every documentary that's been done on ECW, and boy, have I seen my share of those that are non-WWE and WWE. People have always said the same thing. He was like a cult leader. But you have to remember something. ECW took advantage of the fact that the WWE had gone so far to one side of the pendulum. They were so kiddie oriented. They were so in many ways like they are right now. They were very bland. They were trying to appeal to the broadest spectrum of an audience possible, and therefore there was really nothing special about them. They came, if you recall, ECW comes up during the alternative era, and boy, God, do I hate that phrase, but, that's what people identified it as. This was the grunge era.
I hate that era.
Well, that's a whole other podcast, isn't it?
It is.
But I mean, you think of it in terms of music, right? It's another way of explaining
Paul
what's
Heyman
happening in wrestling at the time. So you have sort of this Journey and Def Leppard and Motley Crue and Poison and all of these bands that that rose to the height of selling out arenas. But they had they to the point where when it all came crashing down, people like Rock is dead and will never be revived, which was stupidity beyond words. But the point of it was Rock, if you look at where Rock had started and where it had gone to, it had been so far removed from its anti-establishment roots that it gave way for an entire wave of musicians that were rebelling against it to come up and be noticed, and then they, of course, would become mainstream, and so the circle of life continues. But without Journey's rise to the top and all of those bands that were just like them, you don't get Nirvana. And that's where you find ECW in that niche. They were the Nirvana of wrestling. They were very much going against the grain of the WCW and WWE of that time. One of the things that people tend to not realize about ECW is that the thing that they specialized in, because everyone sort of relates them to blood and guts, and that was a part of it. Certainly, you could not identify ECW without it. But if that's all you see, then you missed the most quintessential element of the ECW product, and that was they consistently gave you something you had never seen before or weren't seeing with any regularity in the Big Two. And whether it was blood and guts or cruiserweights or international that were taken seriously and not made out to be evil heels, things of that nature. They gave you true finishes. Part of the reason why, I don't think people realize this, but part of the reason why the hardcore thing kind of developed in ECW was because there always had to be a winner. There were no countouts. There were no disqualification. So you could have a Dean Malenko-Rey Mysterio match that went on for days because there was no time limit draws either. There had to be a winner, and there weren't going to be unseen Bolorcos. That's twice this week I've used that phrase. Being used. You weren't going to see chair shots in a Dean Malenko match per se, but what you got to see was some of the best wrestling going at that time. On the other hand, because there's no time limit draws and there's no disqualifications and there's no countouts, you had Axl Rotten and Balls Mahoney trying to kill each other with everything they could find. So so when you go into an ECW show, you never knew what you were going to get. And it was always something different, and it was wonderful. Whereas with the other two companies, you knew exactly what you were going to get. You were going to get you were going to get the circus, and that's what you wanted.
Mabel.
That's great.
King Mabel.
Again, you were going to get the circus, and if you didn't want the circus, you went to ECW. And that was really the sort of the genius of Paul Heyman, was looking at what was missing from professional wrestling and providing it, and doing so in a way that he made others believe. Who didn't really think, third and fourth dimensionally about pro wrestling, to say like, oh yeah, this works, this is good, this is something that I want to be a part of. If Paul Heyman, ego is a terrible thing, and sometimes your ego can get the best of you, and that's really the downfall of ECW. Because if Paul Heyman could have taken a step back and allowed himself to be helped and realized that he's not God, then Bubba Ray Dudley balances the checkbook and ECW maybe survives. That was the thing. A lot of the guys in ECW, if you hear the interviews that they give, talk about that they were willing to make sacrifices for only so long, but when Paul Heyman wouldn't budge and wouldn't make changes and wouldn't allow anyone to help him, that's when people started giving, because they had to eat.
If I could add to this a little bit, Mark, too, and feel free to cut me off at any point, but I think part of the thing with Paul is, we always hear the stories about how he ended up owing X amount of dollars to seemingly every performer with ECW towards the end. And, I know that, and you've probably heard the story from dealing with him, but I know Shane Douglas is owed somewhere in the six-figure region to this day by Paul Heyman for, stuff that went on there. And that's why everybody calls Tommy Dreamer the smartest man I ever knew, because he actually got all the money he was owed by Paul Heyman. But I think people still talk highly of him despite that, because Heyman, like we said, he's such a cult of personality, but he came off as very anti-establishment as a whole, and that made people not realize that in ECW, he was the establishment. He's the boss. He's the promoter. He's the guy who is, telling you all these things and making money off of you, while you're eating tuna and rice for, a month straight because you're not making any of your own money during that time, and you're willing to sacrifice all this because the guy is such a good bullshit artist and is able to whip these guys into a frenzied state that they're willing to literally put their bodies on the line in some more extreme circumstances than we've ever seen in any other wrestling promotion for ECW, for, what they deem the cause and what they do, that, Heyman is able to get away with this. But in a way that
the only thing I want to cut you off and say, because I want you to finish, but the only thing I want to add to that is, if anyone ever asked why anyone would have gone to work for Rob, that's why. Rob paid. You were guaranteed to get your money. Rob couldn't afford not to pay people, at least not the expensive talent. So, and I had to make that point. With Paul, people stayed with him because it was almost religious. They believed. He gave his Sermon on the Mount, and they believed. And they waited, and and essentially many of them who stuck with him the longest waited for Godot, and Godot never arrived. So the play. But
thanks for not saying spoiler warning to our listeners who are obviously waiting for Godot fans and wanted to read that.
Oh, come on! You should know that by now. How old is that particular bit of?
Not to mention, I've mentioned more. You listen to my podcast. I constantly referencing for Godot. I showed up to English. In any case. The only point that I was going to make, and I want to pitch back to Pat, was at the end of the day, people could, you could only starve for so long waiting for his promises to come true, and then, so why would you go to XPW? Because the fucking man paid them. Sabu got paid. Shane Douglas got paid. After a while, these people were like, we need to make money. We're starving over here. So Shane Douglas also, he not him so much. He at least, came from WCW, which was a whole other kettle of fish. But, guys like Sabu and Cronus and Big Dick Dudley weren't exactly millionaires.
Yeah, and I think, too, with the thing with Heyman was people believed him because he did have credibility before being a promoter. This was a guy who, at, 15, 16 years of age, was a ringside photographer competing for photos at ringside with Bill Apter of Pro Wrestling Illustrated, got involved with a small tri-state area promotion in the 80s called NSW, doing interviews with people like Superstar Billy Graham and Abdullah the Butcher and such, and involved a little bit in the promotion because his father was an affluent lawyer in the area, so he could get Dad to loan him some money to help these shows out. Made it to the AWA with Vern Gagne, made it to the NWA when it was bought out as World Championship Wrestling and lasted there for a while, and eventually was fired from there. But Paul had credibility to these guys as somebody who was a talent and was not necessarily just some guy with money who was a promoter. Paul knew both sides, and I think from commiserating with the talent so much, it almost made him kind of the worst nightmare because he knew how to play both sides of the fans, and I think that's why you see so many people who stayed with him and, took very bad hits to their checkbook along the way and maybe got evicted from a few apartments along the way because of this guy and how guru-esque he was. And in a way that makes him a bigger scumbag than a guy like a Vince, who, to credit, as long as Vince has been around the wrestling business, up until he was 60, he was almost 60 years old, he was never a talent. So as much as he may have known, he was never one of the boys. Paul Heyman was. And so that he could tap into that mindset and know what these guys go through and still use it against them anyway, that's a pretty evil bastard right there.
Here's my one defense of Paul Heyman, though. I think, and I say this a lot, and I truly believe it, intent plays a role. I think you're a scumbag when the intention is to screw somebody for your own gain. At the end of the day, Paul Heyman just wanted his company to succeed. It may have been single-minded. It may have been, he may have been doing it in the wrong way, in a way nobody approves of, and certainly not paying your talent is up there. But Pat, if a few things change a few details in how the Monday Night Wars and in the late '90s, early 2000s wrestling goes down, and money starts to flow from the sky. Change the fact that maybe TNA changes to Spike a few years earlier, and they decide that they're going to go with ECW and actually give them a fighting chance instead of what happened. And people get paid, then he's not a scumbag. He wanted it to succeed. He wasn't purposely screwing these guys out of money. He wasn't a con artist. So, it's Paul Heyman. If you want to criticize Paul Heyman, and there's certainly a lot to criticize, you criticize the fact that he couldn't get out of he couldn't get out of his own ego's way. And oh God, I think it was said about him. When is Paul Heyman lying when he opens his mouth?
No,
that's also
in defense of Paul Heyman. in defense of Paul Heyman, that's true of almost anyone in the wrestling business, and certainly promoters in general. They almost can't afford to tell the truth.
Right, and like I said, I think when we talk about evil promoters, you have to. Intent is one of those variables that are they con artists or aren't they? And if the intention is to screw people and they're con artists, then that's fine. Then there is no defense of them. Paul Heyman legitimately tried this, and things just did not work out for one reason or another.
To an extent, but at the same time, and I don't mean to cut you off, but Robert brought up the point earlier that he was telling the talent, yes, we're still running shows, we're going to be fine, and I'm trying to secure us a new network, knowing full well that the company is going to go bankrupt and he's not going to pay any of these people. So he goes out and shoots rollerball and negotiates a deal to jump ship to the WWF and get paid there, and still has these people run shows in these far-off towns where they maybe get lucky and they did good at concessions that night, and he can give them, $50, $100 here. There's no intention of ever paying them what he owes them.
Okay, and
I think by the end he had sort of thrown in the towel.
Yeah, and again, when I mentioned Paul Heyman, he's kind of the best and worst as far as promoters go, because he was able to do so much so well, but at the same time there were all of these negatives, and we covered them a fair amount here. And since we talked about Paul Heyman, I want to move this into the contemporary zone. Pat, I want to go to you for this one, because I'm going to bring up the big boxing promoter right now, and I have very little doubt there's a lot of vitriol that's going to flow when I bring up the name of Bob Arum. But I want to get kind of your perspective on him, because he's the guy who, I believe he not manages Pacquiao, but he's the guy who Pacquiao has to go through right now, isn't he?
Yeah,
I mean,
No, he's Manny's promoter. His company Top Rank is currently the holder of Manny Pacquiao and several other guys right now.
Okay, so again, bringing up the name Bob Arum, that's a pretty divisive. You get a reaction when you bring up that name if you know anything about him and his history. So I want you to kind of go with Bob Arum for the time being, and just, your perspective on him, and mine maybe.
Yeah, and Bob's actually, he enjoyed a kind of what's now known as a Pyrrhic victory over Don King, when he basically overtook Don in promotional wars finally after years of fighting. But now it's a Pyrrhic victory because all the talent he invested in is now rebelling against him, and Golden Boy Promotions under Oscar De La Hoya is kind of coming to the forefront as the number one promotional firm, and Bob's slowly losing it. But yeah, Arum's an interesting guy. He's a Harvard-educated lawyer, and basically his first foray into boxing was not doing any kind of promotion. He was on Muhammad Ali's legal defense team that was assembled in order to try to keep him out of jail and try to overturn the ruling against him when Ali refused to be inducted into the United States Armed Forces for Vietnam. And Arum's team that was fighting this, it happened in the mid-'60s when this whole process started, and eventually it was finalized. Ali was sent to jail in, I believe, 1967. But before that, in 1966, Arum was one of the guys who was approached about promoting a fight in Toronto's Maple Leaf Gardens between Ali and the Canadian heavyweight champion, George Chuvalo. And during this whole media foray, Arum was, he gave a quote that should basically be, if you look up Bob Arum in a dictionary, this quote has to be next to him. And they asked him, what do you think about this fight? And Arum, who in hindsight acknowledges he knew nothing about boxing and really still doesn't, said that he thought the only chance that Chuvalo had was to keep hitting Ali in the balls. And when approached the following day, he was like, it was a great fight, and this is, he's a great champion, and I knew from the get-go this was going to be a great competitive fight. And when it was pointed out to him that he had said the exact opposite just 24 hours prior, this is the quote Arum gave. He said, yes, but yesterday I was lying.
Oh, okay. Now, I brought up Bob Arum not just because he's kind of the boxing guy right now, but also because he's the one who had that rather famous rant against MMA that he gave to Ariel Helwani that was beautifully dissected.
Neo-Nazi skinhead.
Homosexual neo-Nazi skinhead.
Yes, they roll around in tights like homosexuals, neo-Nazi skinheads covered with tattoos.
And I don't feel the need to discuss the stupidity of that comment, if for no other reason than because I've heard the point-by-point dissection that Boss Rutan gave on Inside MMA, and I have nothing more to add to the greatness of what he was able to put out there. But for me, one of the quotes from him that kind of uses said, yesterday I was lying. After the dubious decision, Manny Pacquiao's first loss, I forget who he was fighting at the time, his response
Timothy Bradley.
was, yes, thank you, Timothy Bradley. His response was, yeah, it was kind of a bogus fight, but I'm going to make tons of money on the rematch. And I think he said something to that effect at the press conference.
Like, what do you even say to that? Like, all right. Apparently boxing wants below professional wrestling in its inherent honesty.
Yeah. But the thing with Arum is Arum is purportedly, and several comments he's made over the years, and I don't want to get specific with him because I find him very offensive, and I'm a pretty thick-skinned guy, so for me to find him offensive, I think they really touch nerves. He's really one of the biggest racists in all of promotions, period, and he's made several comments over the years when he was really the first guy to recognize how valuable Latino fighters, particularly Mexican and Puerto Rican fighters, were to building an audience and drawing an audience. And, he's one of the first guys to recognize that, and his big promotional cash cow was Oscar De La Hoya for a long time. And they themselves, even while they were promoting together, engaged in several, racist rants against each other that were just so silly. And for Arum to continue, and his promotion is now really built on still Latin fighters and now branching out into the Philippines because of the success of Manny Pacquiao. But because he's such a racist, really, and this is, several people who fought for him or against him are on record as saying they felt they've never, met somebody who's such a virulent, anti-everybody person as Arum, that it was really funny to me that when Oscar De La Hoya in court after he successfully broke his contract with Arum said it felt great to beat one of the biggest Jews to ever come out of Harvard, that Arum was the one who acted all aghast and, said racism has no place in this sport, this is disgusting. And it just harkens back to his origins as yesterday I was lying.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of individual Arum is.
I don't want to get political, but I always, my friend John, who I do the right hook with, will in times like this will always say, leave it to a liberal to show you just how aghast they are at the same behavior that they purport.
Oh, big time. And Arum is that guy for sure. From the rants, the epic wars that I can only imagine to what it would have been like to have been a fly on the wall in situations where Arum and Don King were negotiating with each other, like for the Felix Trinidad-Oscar De La Hoya fight. And this goes all the way back to their promotional ties when they were each putting together the Sugar Ray Leonard-Roberto Duran fight in 1980, the original fight. They met on a plane, and they were on the same plane. They wouldn't directly speak to each other. They each had to have their own mediator talk to the other person's mediator to bring the terms, and they're all sitting right next to each other. But the egos involved were so much that they would not speak a direct word to each other.
Yeah, that's kind of crazy. But now, again, since we're kind of in the modern sense here, I want to go to you for a second here, Mark, because we, kind of the elephant in the room at this particular juncture here is, we're all MMA guys at present time. You can't talk about promoters without talking about Dana White at the moment, and you've done several wonderful one-of podcasts with Say Mercati, and Larry Zonka joined in for one of them, where you have looked at Dana White and his history of decisions and how he carries himself and whatnot. And when we move on to talking about Dana White as the promoter, I want to start with you and just, quite frankly, where do you start with this guy when you're analyzing him as a promoter?
Well, I'll tell you where you start.
In Boston.
Well, kind of. Here's what I want to say. I didn't want to get off this podcast without making this particular statement with regards to Dana White. I said at the top of the podcast, and I was talking about amateur MMA, sometimes you get into promoting because, you are not an athlete. You are not going to be a competitive person, but you want to be close to something that you truly enjoy, you truly love. And if there's one thing I've learned about Dana White, and this is sort of the therapist in me kind of coming out, but I mean, this comes from observation, not blind conjecture. In interviews, he has talked about growing up in boxing and wanting to be close to boxing. And I feel like, the UFC is his bar mitzvah. You know what I mean? It was the UFC is about Dana White wanting to be close to a fighting sport and being summarily rejected and unable to make a living in boxing. So he went above and beyond in creating a fighting sport that he could be integral in and a part of, and that would keep him close to fighters. And when you think about his decision-making from that aspect, when you think about his disregard for women fighters, because, in his mind, fighters look a certain way, fighters act a certain way, fighters fight a certain way. And when he's confronted with something,
time off.
And fighters don't take that. Well, that goes into act a certain way. When you look at when a situation occurs that falls outside of his self-constructed box, yeah, he doesn't have the emotional maturity to handle it. But it also turns a world that he's fashioned for himself upside down. I mean, how many of us can say that they have done everything they can to construct their own little kingdom? And had the this ego and hubris to think that now that I have my kingdom, no one will ever come at me. No one will ever, I cannot be harmed in my own little kingdom. And he keeps finding out that that's not the case. And so he has this history of meltdowns. But look at just a couple of examples, because people might be thinking, well, it's kind of reaching when he says that, this Mr. Therapist that he thinks he is. Well, no. He didn't want women fighters because women aren't fighters. They are, as Pat says, they are barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen. They walk around the ring half naked, holding up cards. And it isn't until one comes along that he's not dumb by any stretch of the imagination. So it isn't until Ronda Rousey comes along and he sees gold in them hills that he says, oh no, women are okay now. See, they only became okay when he knew for sure they were going to make him money. It was certainly never about his regard for women fighters. That's all bullshit. It's strictly, when he realized Ronda Rousey was going to make him a lot of money, suddenly went okay. And I'm pretty sure someone showed him a picture of Felice Herring and said, yeah, you're going to want to get in 115-pound girls because she ain't making 135 and she's hot. She can't fight worth the shit, but she's hot. You look at Roy Nelson. Roy Nelson looks like me, okay? Or I look like Roy Nelson. I am a shorter version of Roy Nelson. This is why
Roy has more hair.
Oh, geez. I'd throw that in. I'm taking a point away for that.
But Roy doesn't look like a fighter. Roy looks like a truck driver. And so the fact that Roy has been successful for so long, I'm sure gives Dana White nightmares. He just doesn't understand how that's even possible. And so no matter what Roy does, he's wrong, because Roy doesn't look like a fighter. And this goes on and on. So I don't know if you guys agree or disagree, but this has sort of been my assessment of Dana White, is that the UFC allows him to be close to fighting, which is ultimately what he wanted, and that he's got a little box that he's constructed of himself, and that box to him is reality, and he can't handle anything outside of that box, which is unfortunate because a good CEO of a company is someone who thinks outside of the box. Do you hear me, Warner Brothers Studio? You're screwing up Batman versus Superman. You're fucking it up. Think outside. Sorry. Wrong podcast.
No, that's fine. It doesn't. Again, since we're talking promoters, I haven't talked about like movie promotion here very deliberately, but studios have to promote stuff too. So if we wanted to rant against them, it's not that big of a leap.
I'm going to need alcohol, and I have to take my kid to get a haircut at the Magic Kingdom tomorrow. So please, let's not talk about that.
No, I'm just saying you're not. There is a legitimate line of thought that led you to that point, and it is not out of place here. So again, sticking kind of with Dana White, Pat, I want to go to you. The guy failed to be a...
You guys see what I'm saying, though? Hang on, before you continue, because I don't want to make sure I'm sound like a lunatic. You guys see what I'm saying about Dana White?
Well,
yes,
lunacy aside,
I think we do.
Yeah, whether or not you sound like a lunatic, it makes no difference if your point is valid or sounds correct, and I tend to agree with it.
Okay, fair enough.
Okay, so again, Pat, just kind of, Dana White failed to be, a big boxing promoter, which he was in boxing for a while. I'm just kind of curious as, how does he, I'm struggling to phrase this properly, but, we've talked about boxing promoters here for a while and various degrees of scumbaggery, since that's what we're focusing on. How does he stack up as far as, boxing promoters go, where he falls in that spectrum? And also just to kind of get you in there with Mark's comments, your thoughts on him as a promoter in general.
I mean, the thing with Dana White is, he talks so much about his past, how he was teaching boxing at a YMCA and was eventually approached by the local mob that he had to, and the Boston local mob was Whitey Bulger's gang, so it's not like they were some nickel and dime artists. This was legitimately one of the biggest organized crime groups in the country, and according to him, they tried to squeeze him out of Boston because they wanted a piece of his ever so lucrative YMCA boxing classes. So, I mean, right away there, you have to take everything the guy says with a grain of salt. You know, Dana White talks about being squeezed out of the boxing industry as a promoter because the other promoters didn't want him involved. And no boxing promoter wants any other promoter involved. Has it stopped guys like Don King, who is a convicted felon of manslaughter, from getting what he wanted? Has it stopped Bob Arum, who was a lawyer from Harvard, who knew nothing of actual boxing, couldn't tell you the difference between Muhammad Ali and Ali Sheedy? Did it stop him from becoming a juggernaut? No. So I think a lot of Dana White's anger is that his own inability to make it in an established...
You know, this is not just a promoter thing. This tends to be a human thing. But, you know, whenever something goes wrong, it's someone else's fault. God forbid you actually just weren't adequate.
Yeah, and I think part of with Dana White, one of the biggest things you could point to in that is, if you remember Chuck Liddell's first fight with Rampage Jackson that happened over in Pride, Dana actually sat in on commentary for that fight, and Rampage basically beats the piss out of Chuck for the entirety of the fight, and all you can ever hear from Dana White is, yeah, this wasn't the game plan, yeah, this wasn't the game plan, in rapid succession over and over, not taking any, you know, blame for this at all. This wasn't the game plan we talked about, was the line of the night from him.
Chuck's not throwing leg kicks. I mean, never mind the fact that Rampage was just a better fighter ever than Chuck Liddell was.
Yeah, never does that ever step into the equation. And you know, Dana basically, Dana is kind of almost like Paul Heyman in a lot of ways, in that he took this anti-establishment product that he became so passionate about because it was his way to get somewhere with it. And I do think Dana White genuinely loves MMA. I do think he has a real love for the sport, but I think he loves himself a whole lot more, and I think he loves what he gets out of it a whole lot more. And I think that's ultimately where things led to. And, you know, when you watch things like, if you guys ever watch Michael Chiavello's show on Access TV, The Voice Versus, during the episode with Dana White, which is conducted in his office, he has a large portrait of a Yakuza member having sex with what I assume to be a prostitute. And that's one of his proudest possessions, and he gladly brags about how he paid something close to like $250,000 for it. And, you know, that's an act of shameless self-promotion that we talk about. And he probably more than anybody we will talk about is the most shameless self-promoter of anyone. And for a guy who claims that he wants to try to build the brand of MMA and how it's already the second biggest sport in the world, I don't hear him talk nearly enough about the actual participants themselves as much as he does himself, followed by the UFC as a company.
Okay. I want to read you guys a list of something, okay? I'm going to read you the list, and then we can talk about what it is the list of. You ready? Okay. Can I do this, Rob? This is your show.
Yeah, okay. Oh, by all means.
Frequent mood swings, stormy relationships, social isolation, angry outbursts, suspicion and mistrust of others, difficulty making friends, a need for instant gratification, poor impulse control, alcohol or substance abuse. We'd probably throw gambling in there as well. What do you think that's a list of?
Asperger's syndrome symptoms.
Close.
Kind of. Actually, I know this because I have mental health issues, surprise for listening, but I believe that's the list for bipolar disorder.
Close. A lot of this is sort of a Venn diagram when you start talking about symptoms of mental health issues. This is actually a general list of symptoms of personality disorders. Now,
like paranoid narcissism?
Those are two different things. So I want to read you two of these, okay? Speaking of narcissism, these are the traits of narcissist personality disorder. Believing that you're better than others, fantasizing about power, success, and attractiveness, exaggerating your achievements or talents, expecting constant praise and admiration, failing to recognize other people's emotions and feelings. Like maybe George St. Pierre sitting at the same table as you, having an anxiety attack and a complete meltdown after having been belted about the head for 25 minutes. That would be the other one, you know. And when you start getting into mental health issues, especially in Access 2, they tend, like I said, it tends to be more of a Venn diagram than a strict. It has to be this or this. But this is another one: histrionic personality disorder, constantly seeking attention, excessively emotional, extreme sensitivity to others' approval, unstable mood, excessive concern with physical appearance. I mean, what else needs to be said about Dana White? You guys wonder why I'm...
If you don't...
We could also point out, though, that for all his talk of being squeezed out of boxing by these promoters who didn't want him to inside, you know, for whatever one reason may be. I think Dana likes to think it's because they knew he would be bigger than all of them, and thus they had to get him out. What have we seen with the Zuffa buyout of Strikeforce, the attempt at poaching Bellator talent, closing into WEC, into the UFC? Where's lack of empathy along those lines?
Well, no, in those cases, those companies were wrong. Don't you understand?
That's what it was.
How dare they do things differently?
No, Strikeforce was a terrible company with a bunch of nobodies and talentless wonders, except for Alistair Overeem, who they then signed, or Jake Shields, who they signed, or Dan Henderson, who came back to the U, or Nick Diaz, who they signed away from the company, or
fun fact: how many of those people got title shots?
Almost immediate.
But if we could just very briefly, and we're kind of running short of time here, but you mentioned a bunch of those things, and I just feel like we'd also be remiss if we didn't talk about Vince McMahon. And I don't want to go.
That would be a glaring omission.
I don't want to go too in depth because, like I said, we're kind of short of time, and Vince McMahon is his own series of podcasts. Should we ever get to that? Should we ever, in various forms? I mean, you could do a deconstructing. I could do him on this one for bad guys, and we could just, do a whole month on the Radulich and Broadcasting Network just talking about Vince McMahon in various forms.
Vince McMahon the early years. Vince McMahon the sexual predator. Vince McMahon. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So again, we could go, but just since you've been around the wrestling business, Mark, just kind of Vince McMahon, and for my money, he gets kind of a bad rap in the sense that he drove all the other. He killed the territory system, even though it was dying even though it was dying on its own. But no, he's the one who killed it, and how dare he not induct Randy Savage into the Hall of Fame? All the laundry list of things that people have against Vince McMahon. I'm just. Kind of where do you stand on him as a promoter, on his company, just, where you personally sit on the issue of Vince McMahon?
My issue with Vince McMahon, other than the fact that he's an alleged rapist, is that allegedly he's a rapist.
We use that phrase a lot when talking about the past of professional wrestling promoters, don't we?
We use that. I don't know if you ever listened to the Casual Heroes episode where I threw out there that Eddie Guerrero was allegedly allegedly would stalk like teenage girls. No, allegedly stalk teenage girls at the local movie co where my wife grew up in New Tampa. Oh yeah, she tells me stories about how Eddie Guerrero would cruise the parking lot of the movie co looking for young Tail. And I brought that up at Casual Hero.
Is she confusing him with Jerry Lawler?
No, she didn't grow up in Memphis. This is New Tampa, where he is, where he's from. And Chris, from the moderator of the Casual Heroes podcast, starts screaming in my ear, allegedly, Jesus Christ. And I'm like, it's not alleged when I have an eyewitness.
Yes, and just because, and I brought this up before, people have flaws. That doesn't mean acknowledging them does not in any way diminish what you necessarily enjoy about them. Walt Disney was kind of an anti-Semite. I still derive great pleasure from watching movies done by his company.
But you asked me about Vince McMahon.
Yes, back to Vince McMahon, and again, alleged rapist.
Yeah, alleged rape. Aside from his being an alleged rapist, the thing that I don't like about Vince McMahon the most, and I think this is his defining characteristic in my opinion, is that he doesn't actually want to be a wrestling promoter. His dad was a wrestling promoter. His dad was willing to go along to get along in the territory system, and allegedly he told Vince McMahon, yes, you can buy the company from me, but don't go and completely fuck over.
Don't compete with other people.
Yeah, don't betray the trust that we have with these other promoters, and that is exactly what he did. But I don't want to move away from my point that I was trying to make, which was before he bought the WWE, or I guess by that point it was the WWE, he had tried promoting other kinds of things. He had tried promoting concerts, boxing, and he was a failure at almost everything that he did. And when he got the company from his dad, this was there was nothing else left. He had tried everything. And I think he was also broke. He went to the one thing that his family had been successful with because he had nothing else. But I think it was a bitter pill for him to swallow because that's not what he wanted to do. He wanted to be something else. And ever since then, if you look at what the WWE has become, it's become a reflection of Vince's complete distaste, his disregard of pro wrestling. You know, he's made statements over the years like, you know, we don't want to insult people's intelligence. And I'm sure, you know, when Pat reflects on that, he was just like, why would you pee all over my childhood? Why would you destroy a good thing? You know, because what Vince McMahon was really saying there was, we're gonna do away with kayfabe. We're gonna do away with all, you know, with this and that, everything that made wrestling special and wonderful. We're gonna pull back the curtain, and we're gonna give you tripe. And it's like, well, why would you do that? Why would you deconstruct the entire industry? You know,
quite frankly, we think you're tired of having your intelligence insulted.
Yeah. So when you think about it, for his own, because to satiate his own ego. And to make up for the fact that he was an abysmal failure at everything else he ever did, he deconstructed the entire professional wrestling industry to suit his needs. And he turned it into a traveling circus. That's what the WWE really is. It's a traveling, you know, it's half a soap opera, half a circus. And I know it drives a lot of old school people crazy. And when you look at it today, it's still a reflection of that model. It's still a reflection of their inability to look at what makes wrestling successful. This is why I'm a Paul Heyman. And why, when we talked about him earlier, I rushed to his defense. Because Paul Heyman was a wrestling guy, and I'm a wrestling guy, and I want to watch wrestling. And it drives, and Pat's listening to this and thinking about my roster from the Casual Heroes last night and goes, are you out of your fucking mind? How does that match up? But it's true, goddammit. I am a wrestling guy, and I want to see wrestling when I watch the WWE. And Vince McMahon and now his son-in-law and his daughter are doing everything to prevent that from actually happening. Instead, they're going to continue to force feed the traveling circus that is their current show.
Says the guy who picked the Ultimate Warrior.
Fuck off. Ultimate Warrior was awesome.
All right, we're about to run out of live time, so anyone out there listening live, I will have links up to the following recording because I absolutely have to give Pat a chance to go on Vince McMahon for a little bit. So I'll have the links up later for that. Pat, same series of questions about, you know, Vince McMahon, where you stand on him, his promotion and everything, and him as a promoter in general.
You know, Vince is probably the greatest promoter of at least the modern era in all its facets. I mean, that includes boxing, combat sports, because nobody's been as successful. Yeah, nobody's been as long successfully as he has around the same time. And even in his failed ventures, he's still been successful enough elsewhere that it didn't matter. You know, stuff like the World Bodybuilding Federation and the XFL, which the XFL is not the failure people make it out to be. The XFL failed because the NFL basically broke antitrust laws and nobody persecuted them on it because the NFL is big business. So But that's a whole other story for a whole other day. But, you know, Vince is a guy who, and I think Mark hit the nail on the head, that he didn't want to be a wrestling promoter. He wanted to be an entertainment promoter as a whole. He wanted to encompass all of entertainment. And when he just couldn't cut it doing that, I mean, be it, you know, like he started promoting rock concerts when he was still in college at East Carolina, and you know, later on tried his hand at several different things. Even while running the WWF, when it was at its peak of Hulkamania, he still decided he was going to promote Sugar Ray Leonard's fight with Donnie Lalonde, and that didn't make as much money as any of Leonard's, you know, recent fights had with guys like Marvin Hagler. And you know, so Vince has always tried to expand, but ultimately just the constant failure of it has led to him, you know, manifesting these goals into the one company he had that was successful. And, you know, we see, once the name changed to World Wrestling Entertainment, that was kind of the final straw in acknowledging that this is not just a wrestling company. This is going to be an entertainment conglomerate. And we've seen it expand into things now, like you have Total Divas, which is a reality show based around performers in his company, and it's completely off the beaten path. Non-wrestling fans, watch Total Divas and enjoy it, and don't dare tune into Monday Night Raw because they don't care about that. They just care about Total Divas. And, you know, it's an interesting parallel that it's almost like Hamlet, where Hamlet's a good guy in a bad world that he doesn't understand. Vince is a guy who has these goals and aspirations, but is stuck in this world that he doesn't want to be in, but he's very good at it. And it's such a weird parallel, but at the same time, Vince is a guy who, according to, you know, most people who know him well and give interviews, he's completely consumed by making the WWE successful. And he lives, sleeps, breathes WWE. And goes so far as to get hands-on with performers to do things like show R-Truth how he wants them to dance to the ring. And, you know, I remember Tammy Sitch telling me a story a couple of years ago about how when she was doing her first, like, real revealing photo shoot for Raw magazine, Vince was there, and they did it at Vince's house, and he's getting up on the chairs and posing and showing her how he wants to pose because that's how obsessed he is with success. And I can respect that because that's a guy who's willing to give everything. But at the same time, this is a guy who doesn't have a real perception of the real world because he's been so consumed by this that he's so out of touch with everything outside of WWE that it creates a disconnect, not just with, people outside of wrestling, but his own performers who have, lives. They have personal lives. They're, The Miz is not The Miz all the time. The Miz is Mike Mizanin when he goes home and takes his hat off and, hangs out with his super hot fiancée. There's a difference between Mike Mizanin and The Miz. There's a difference between John Cena, the television performer, and John Cena, the guy. And Vince is always Vince. Yes, there's the Mr. McMahon character, but as people will point out, the greatest characters are extensions of real personality. And the Mr. McMahon character is obsessive, power-hungry, success-hungry, and that's Vince, and that's always been him. Ever since he was a young man, determined to prove that he was more than just this famous promoter's son. He wanted to exceed everything that was done and become the biggest and the greatest at whatever it was he was trying to do, be it rock concerts, wrestling, boxing, bodybuilding, football, what have you. And to his credit, he is. But at the same time, I think he's a guy who you see what the ultimate price can be when you're trying to be that successful in this game. And we've seen more performers die having performed under him. We've seen, constant trials and lawsuits and all these things go at him so hard at the cost of what? And you have to question yourself at that point, like, how many millions can I make? What really makes this worth this against all these problems and all these disconnects and everything I kind of shut myself out from? Because Vince is people describe him as a nut because he's so willing to give everything into this product that he doesn't have a connection with the real world. And that's a scary, scary thought for somebody like me.
But the other thing about it, Pat, is that to this day, right now, right this very minute in 2013, he would still take every dollar out of the WWE. And if he knew he could be successful at anything else, movies, football, etc., the WWE exists for Vince McMahon as a battery for his other endeavors. And, he protects his battery. He makes sure his battery is continually to be successful. He doesn't take his eye off the ball. But that's really what it is. It's this platform from which he can divert money into other things that he really wants to do. And I think that's the other thing that drives me crazy about this is, I said this about, to a degree, about Johnny Hendricks, and I've said it before. Look, if you don't care enough about what it is you're doing, why should I? And it shows. It absolutely shows at times with the WWE that it's his burden. It's both his burden, that he carries around, but it's also the life's blood that allows him to do anything else and then fall on his face.
Yeah, I don't disagree at all.
All right. I think that'll wrap. Because I know you're such a huge fan of Samuel L. Jackson, Pat, I have to get your opinion, your quick thoughts on his character, the Sultan, from the abysmal Wayans Brothers movie, The Great White Hype.
How could you say that's abysmal?
Is anything but abysmal. That movie is anything but abysmal.
Get him, Pat. Get him.
that movie.
All right. I will retract my abysmal qualifier.
That movie is sadly the most realistic portrayal of the politics of boxing and, by extension nowadays, combat sports that you will ever see. They will hype anything, any which way they can. These backdoor crazy dealings, these nefarious characters, it's all the real thing. Now, they satirize it, absolutely. They I don't think Don King has ever drawn a sword on anybody, but I know that he has walked in with a duffel bag full of $500,000 to steal a fighter from another promoter. I know that he had the entire NYPD on notice because Mitch Green was going to march to his office, which was located in Madison Square Garden at the time, surrounded by blood to get money he thought King owed him, and King notified the entire NYPD and hired a private security force armed with automatic weapons. These things happen. They're satirized, but that movie is hilarious. Yes, it's a comedy. Of course it's funny. But these are things that really went on. And, when they were trying to come up with a good opponent for Floyd Patterson, the heavyweight champion at one point in real life, they decided to take Pete Rademacher, who had won an Olympic gold medal, and throw him in his first pro fight into a heavyweight title fight. There was a time when Jimmy Jacobs, who is probably best known as one half of the early father figure duo of Jacobs and Caton to Mike Tyson, whom he cut ties with and signed with King, he was a world handball champion and a great athlete, and he was secretly being trained by Customato, the early trainer of Mike Tyson, to make a pro debut against Floyd Patterson with the same intent in mind. So this taking somebody with some amateur past and no professional experience and throwing them into a heavyweight title fight, not without precedent. The illegal backdoor dealings of Fred Sultan, a.k.a. Don King, not without precedent. The people who crusade against him and are ultimately bought out by him, played by Jeff Goldblum, like Patty Flood and Al Braverman, not without precedent. It's crazy, but it's true. Now, the movie has some gems in it as far as, good laughs and everything, but boxing fans, particularly the devout ones who are aware of what goes on, can vouch for the legitimacy of that film 100 times over, and it's sad but true is the best way to describe it.
Okay, my abysmal qualifier comes from having seen... I've seen it, but it was a long time ago, and I have absolutely no patience for the Wayans brothers in jail, so I may have been unduly prejudiced as far as that goes.
In fairness, it's only Damon.
Okay, well, I don't like... I think Keenan Ivory is the only Wayans brother who I've ever seen and thought, well, you don't suck horribly, but I might have to track that down and watch it again just to kind of give it a fair viewing. Mark, again, without my abysmal qualifier, very quickly, Samuel L. Jackson as unscrupulous boxing promoter Don King, basically.
Oh, I mean, I really can't add anything more to this. I think Pat really nailed it. First of all, Samuel L. Jackson's great in everything he does. He's hilarious. Whether he's overacting or not. Why? Why do you hate Samuel L. Jackson?
Have you ever seen Jungle Fever?
Moving on.
Okay.
So,
Okay. Moving on.
Is that a sensitive subject? Everybody get all quiet?
No, I haven't seen it.
Where can you go to get married to a man?
Samuel L. Jackson's the hardest working man in Hollywood. Pay him respect. Respect, Pat. No, I mean, Samuel L. Jackson was great. I mean, it's the same thing as the, boy, we are ending where we started, aren't we?
I like circular.
Really, it's the same thing as the guy who played the Don King knockoff in Rocky V. I mean, how hard is, chew up the scenery and act like Don King. You got it. Samuel L. Jackson did a great job of that. And he had, and he was tired of the most motherfucking snakes on the plane, and that's really all I have to say.
Although Paul Winfield was great actually playing Don King in the HBO Tyson movie. We have to throw in a special mention there.
Oh, Paul Winfield was... You know what Paul Winfield is also excellent in? The captain who has his mind taken over and nearly kills Kirk in Star Trek The Wrath of Khan.
Also true. But that's
right.
Another podcast for another day.
Indeed.
You know what's terrible?
Right.
Star Trek Into Darkness. Want me to hear your rant about that again?
Not again, no. I think the first time was enough for everyone.
I still haven't seen it. I just didn't care enough to go see it, and which is sad because I really like...
Khan review.
Yeah,
it's a cover song. It's a cover song of The Wrath of Khan, and it's terrible.
Which is sad because I really like Benedict Cumberbatch, and I was hoping he'd do a good job. And from what I've heard, he's a good part of the movie, but everything just kind of falls flat.
I liken it to hearing Pat Boone sing Alice Cooper.
First of all, that's awesome. Okay, number one. Pat Boone in a Metal Mood is one of the greatest albums of all time. If you like Benedict Cumberbatch, just go see The Hobbit and watch him be the dragon, and that'll be good enough. He's
also going to be the Necromancer, so he gets to be Sauron, too.
There you go.
All right. Well, thanks, guys, for being on for this one. I have to apologize for being late to this. To put it bluntly, shit happens. But, so, going into plugs, Mr. Radulich, what do you have to plug coming up?
I'm going on a cruise on Sunday. That's what I'm going to plug. No, just kidding. This week, I am actually going to be off for the next week. I'm not doing this. That's why I did a podcast almost every night this week except for Monday, much to the chagrin of my wife. But, she gets me all next week, so there you go. You got to have balance. Everything resumes the following week. Long Road to Ruin will be back December 3rd. Start the two-part Die Hard podcast. I think when we come back that same week, there'll be another Casual Heroes follow-up to our draft where my guy is Goldberg, my number one face is the Ultimate Warrior, my number one heel is CM Punk. Money, 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 money. Take that, Pat. With your Bruno Sammartino and your wrestlers who are old as dirt. Anywho.
I haven't heard that one yet. Don't spoil it for me.
Fair enough. No, well, look, I've spoiled nothing because you haven't heard Jed's lineup yet, so that's all I'm going to say.
Oh, God.
Okay. I'll find it online. They have a website, right?
It's thecasualheroes.com. Yeah, unfortunately, I'm having some trouble uploading that show to the Radulich Broadcasting Network. So for the time being, go ahead and give them the hits. Go over to thecasualheroes.com and hear myself and Pat be a part of the first ever Casual Heroes WrestleCast Fantasy Draft and know that my roster is better than everybody else's.
I will keep that in mind.
Besides that, I'll be on the 401 Gun Pound radio show a week from Sunday, and we'll be previewing the best fight card of the year, Mark Hunt versus Bigfoot Silva. Hot damn. That's really all I got.
If it was just for the title, you would be in hog heaven.
Oh my God, it doesn't matter if it's for the title. As far as I'm concerned, the winner of that card, the winner of that fight is the People's Champion.
The chosen People's Champion?
Yes, the chosen People's Champion. Jews love them fat Samoans. What do you want from me? And tall Brazilians.
Funny. Oh man. Oh, and I'm like the only one on this podcast. I don't know. Are you Jewish, Pat?
I am not one of the chosen people. I am actually a Christian, so Shawn Michaels and I can hang out and do some Bible study every so often.
I thought you were Catholic. He's a Baptist, and you guys don't get along. Because God forbid we disagree about...
He is a born-again Christian. I am a born-again Christian.
Oh, okay. You were raised Catholic then?
Indeed.
Okay. Not that has any bearing on anything whatsoever.
Apparently it does, but we just don't realize it, I guess. Who
I don't
knows,
care.
I know that you don't, Robert, but you're one of the select few without prejudice, and I thank you for that.
No. I have prejudice. I'm prejudiced against everyone equally.
Oh, good.
Well, then we can't complain, really, at that point. But I guess I'll get my plug in
that's
now.
my thing. I have been vastly misrepresented, but I'm going to shorten this story. But someone has called me a racist in the past. I said nothing to actually earn said criticism, but it's been levied at me. So my response then and ever since has been, I hate the human race. So if you're not a member of the human race, you're fine. And yes, that means I have self-loathing issues. Let's not get into it. This is not my mental health set.
No, that'll be
I
a
was
different
once called a racist. Somebody thought I said something racially insensitive to the black folks, and I responded with, "Oh yeah, well that sounds like a pot calling a kettle. Oh wait."
Oh,
TP, where's Bad News Brown to make me eat my words?
All right. Since you're talking, Pat, do you have anything you want to plug coming up?
I do. You can listen to the Casual Heroes podcast, the first ever wrestling fantasy draft that Mark and I participated in. You can hear all about Mark's his amazing roster that would sell out 3/4 of any local VFW. You can hear my awesome roster, which would be making gangbuster dollars, be it 1958 or 2013
no one knows who Bruno Sammartino is.
I know who Bruno Sammartino is.
Great.
Hey,
You're
I
both
still got Dusty Rhodes and Ted DiBiase and, a plethora of big money draws everywhere on my roster. Not guys who, go into Braintree, Massachusetts high school gyms and excite a bunch of marks who chant this is awesome when they see a headlock.
So you just have all the egos to contend with.
I've got one big ego that I think I need to worry about, but otherwise I think I'm in good shape.
All right.
Because that big ego is still going to be going through the pay window, baby.
I have Brock Lesnar. That's all that matters.
Dude, Brock is money.
I have Brock Lesnar, Samoa Joe, CM Punk, The Ultimate Warrior, and Bill Goldberg. Those are the four or five horsemen right there.
That's hey, Brock Lesnar is one of only 3 people to do 3 million back-to-back pay-per-view events.
Yeah, I can't wait for this. We're apparently on the next Casual Heroes podcast. The follow-up from this is we're all supposed to rip each other's rosters apart, and everyone had a good laugh at my Ultimate Warrior pick, except that all of my guys drew money, Pat.
Where did CM Punk draw money again?
Nobody has drawn more money than Bruno. I'll defend Bruno Sammartino as far as that goes.
Yeah, but the amount of money he drew in those days dollars was like $1.50. Compared
but if
to now.
you adjust it for inflation, he's bigger than Hogan.
No, it's the other way. It works the other way. No one drew more money than Brock Lesnar.
Okay. I still have to listen to that. So let's.
We'll put your big draws against Bruno, Dusty, Ted DiBiase, Vader. Who else do I have there that drew some money?
DiBiase never really drew money.
I have Petey Williams.
Baby, Mid-South.
I have Petey Williams. Okay, the Canadian Destroyer is the greatest wrestling move in the history of anything.
Oh God, we could do a whole podcast about how much I hate the Canadian Destroyer.
You and the Suicidal Dragon. I would have to track down the YouTube sensation, the Suicidal Dragon, and have him on for that one.
I would love to do an entire podcast about why the Canadian Destroyer sucks, and it has nothing to do with it being Canadian.
Really? Well, now I'm interested. And that's jokes at the expense of the dwellers of America's hat. All right.
You suck.
Yeah,
Canadian.
I still got some family there too, so.
Okay, Mark, we kind of got off track there. Was there anything you didn't get to plug that you wanted to before we...
No, and the goddamn podcast. What's wrong with you?
Just making... I didn't want you to be shortchanged. All right.
We know you'd like to complain about that one, don't we?
I don't know. I've never complained about it, but... Okay, for my own personal plug...
I was making a racially insensitive joke.
I don't know.
I chose my words carefully.
There you go. Good job. Someone out there will be offended, but
Bob
it's
Arum.
also the internet. But it's also the internet, so everyone's offended no matter what.
If we didn't offend Bob Arum yet, I think I did it just there.
I'm pretty sure
right.
before we got to Bob Arum, I offended Vince McMahon and Dana White. I'm never going to be allowed to go to a TV show, which is fine. I have two kids now.
Hey, no,
I'm about to have a second child. I'm probably not going to be going to see anything for quite some time, for the next 10 years.
I was going to say, the intern who listens to the 411 Ground and Pound show, who got your hint about Cormier and Evans anyway, is not listening to this.
All right, fair enough.
All right, so my own personal plugs before we go further off the rails.
We're not worried about you, Dave Meltzer.
I don't know if you offended me or Meltzer.
No, that was strictly Meltzer.
Okay. Locked in the Guillotine is live right now. I break down UFC 167. I have a bit of a deconstructing of specifically what I thought was the most ludicrous statement Dana White made during his meltdown, which was about GSP owing people. So if you're interested, read that.
I did miss one thing. Yeah, there's a special deconstructing. It was mostly focusing on GSP, though I did a long rant on the media as well. And Samer and I got into a sissy slap fight over the 70% comment Johnny Hendricks made, and that's up on the site as well right now. It's the 401 Ground and Pound special, deconstructing GSP versus Johnny Hendricks.
It is a very good podcast. I've listened to it, so if you haven't, please check that out. I will be hosting the 411 Ground and Pound radio show this Sunday, as Mark will be on a cruise. So I get to field calls and try and play referee to Pat Mullin and Jeff Harris. Should be good times.
We all know who's doing the job there, because this guy don't lay down for nobody. The Heartbreak Kid don't lay down.
There's really only one way to control Jeff, and that is hand firmly on the mute button.
But we will be previewing the tough finale, which will be fun because I haven't seen a single episode of this particular season.
You ain't missed much. The girls were good. The girl fights were good. The guy fights were meh.
And next week, this same time, Everyone Loves a Bad Guy will be back. Since Mark will still be gone, I'm going to hold off both my Mr. Burns podcast and starting the Disney Villains podcast, both of which he is requested to be a part of.
I'm going to bring my kid in on them. She's 2, and I understand her, but she might not be completely understandable to everybody else. So we're going to have fun with that one.
Hey, as long as you can provide translation as needed, then have at it.
Fair enough.
So I'll be back next week with something else to fill time between those. I'll come up with something. I might finally get around. I think I'll have to do Loki in 2 parts, one with Jeff and one with Pat, because I think if I have them on the same time and I reference Loki as a Disney character, the world will explode.
Oh, you got that straight.
All right. So, again, same time next week for Everyone Loves a Bad Guy. And long overdue, I'm closing this out for Mark Radulich, who will be on vacation in the near future. For Pat Mullin, who is from Brooklyn and not Long Island, I am Robert Winfree, and I will see you back here next week.
So say good night to the bad guy.